Hey, welcome back to the Mining Pod. This is your news roundup brought to you by Fractal Bitcoin. We'll be right into it with all the mining headlines from this week after word from our sponsors. Okay, we're back into it, and we're always starting off with our hash rate index update. Mr. Difficulty Weatherman, Matthew, what are we seeing this week? Really do that though.
You usually open up the show with like a, hey guys, how's it going? How have you been this week? We're getting right into the forecast.
Well, we chatted before this. Yeah, we already chatted. The audience doesn't care anymore. They're tired of it.
In an odd turn of events, we have hash price increasing, yet expecting a major difficulty decrease. Maybe this is because we've had just an onward march of difficulty increases coming about. Although, let's see, how we are only 35% of the way through the epoch. So I honestly expect this to change quite a bit before the actual adjustment date, which right now is anticipated for May 4th. Yeah, I mean, there some interesting stuff happened in the transaction fee market that maybe you guys want to add some color on. I wish Charlie was on to cover this because I don't know much about this. So please inform me.
Will might have more to say. It just seems like ordinal degens being ordinal degens, and we're getting like a little bit of a pop. We think went back above 1% blocks made up of transaction fees, but honestly, not the jumps that we were used to in 2023 and in 2024 ahead of the halving.
Yeah. So what happened with transaction fees? The pop was from a protocol called Alkanes, and my understanding is it's a type of roll up on Bitcoin that's been developed. Take this with a grain of salt because I've looked at this only passingly. And go check out Bitcoin Season 2 where we talk about these things more often. But essentially, it's another protocol on top of Bitcoin, has its own kind of token thing going on. And there was a lot of fervent speculative fever on top of Bitcoin this week, which pushed up transaction fees. You can see the fee span is from a low end of 5 sats per VByte all the way up to almost 550 sats per VByte. And so that's a nice little pump. Fees are still pretty low historically, but this is nice to see them kind of inching back up, and that's definitely helping with like hash price. But I would say like the midweek pump on Bitcoin price has been a more significant factor in hash rate or hash price.
Yeah, the transaction fees are definitely on the margin. A few more things on that. So it's at 3% of block rewards, 3.3% according to hash rate index in the last 24 hours, which is like, we're eating big right now, y'all. We're going back to ribeyes instead of ramen, compared to where it's been. That's still kind of like 2 to 3% was kind of the average for a long time before ordinals kicked off. So like we're kind of reverting back to a mean. But I think part of the reason for that too is block times are coming in much slower because hash rate is getting absolutely demolished right now. We've lost about 100 exahashes since Bitcoin's hash rate hit an all-time high of, about 121 exahashes a second on the 7-day average on April 8th. That's kind of lurking in the background here, and maybe it's something we should do some follow-up reporting on, because this seems much greater than just, oscillations in Bitcoin's hash rate because of luck. This is not normal variability. I wonder if we have some seasonality coming into effect here, or if a lot of hash rate went offline in a certain country, like is something going on in Russia? Are there some big miners in the US who are going down? That's a big haircut. And that's going to hopefully give miners some reprieve here in a few weeks, as the estimated difficulty adjustment's at like negative 8% right now.
Very interesting developments in the Bitcoin hash price, hash rate, network data, honestly, developments right now. That's a lot of hash rate coming offline. And also 529 sats per VByte is just unreal, given that we were clearing the mempool at 1-2 sats per VByte for really weeks in a row, right? Wild stuff. I wonder if some of the ASICs were like coming offline at these big companies transitioning to AI. I wonder if that's a part of this.
That's good insight. one other thing I wanted to bring up was all the Coinbase and Matrixport loans that happened this week. So it probably not enough of a news item to really have a segment on it. We might do a newsletter instead. But basically, Coinbase and Matrixport are two large financial institutions out there. Everyone knows Coinbase, but Matrixport is a kind of a newer one from Jihan Wu, who's also behind Bitdeer and formerly at Bitmain. And they gave out very, very large loans to both CleanSpark Riot and Bitdeer over the course of the last few weeks. And those loans sort of come at a time when hash price is very low. And also, it doesn't really look like a great time to tap the ATM market. So looks like Bitcoin miners are kind of pivoting, turning back towards selling their Bitcoin. For example, CleanSpark started selling Bitcoin for the first time in a while again, kind of, selling the commodity they produce in order to fund operations. What a crazy idea. And that seems to be coming back into vogue at the moment, where you either use debt agreements with like low interest rate loans, or you sell your commodity to fund operations. That's coming back. And I think the current environment where people don't want to tap ATMs, they don't want to sell shares at the moment with a weak environment, that's why they're tapping to these other markets. I don't think the convertible note market's really as interesting as it was a few months ago either. So yeah, we'll finish there. And then I want to jump to this fun story. Listen in for a second and we'll jump back.
Agency's cargo theft unit arresting 2 members of a South American theft group for possessing stolen cargo. Police say they recovered nearly $4 million worth of stolen property. The stolen goods included tequila, shoes, and clothes. Investigators also say they intercepted a stolen shipment of Bitcoin mining computers worth more than $2 million before it can leave LAX for Hong Kong.
Okay, so that's a fun little story that is also covered by our friends at the Miner Mag. I'll pull up that image if you're watching on CoinDesk or YouTube TV. And basically, the LAPD recovered, quote unquote, $2.7 million in stolen Bitcoin miners. And as you can see, lined up on the street here, we have a bunch of S9s. Perhaps these are not the units that were stolen. As of this report, I can only see that they are Bitcoin mining computers that were intercepted at LAX and on their way for Hong Kong, which seems a little backwards. Normally they come to the US and not back to Asia. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see this story kind of break out. And I do think these are the kind of stories that maybe bring some fear to people outside of Bitcoin mining. They're like a little confused to see a bust like this. Any thoughts on this story from either of you guys?
I want to know who has $2.5 million of S9 sitting around. That's what I want to know. How cheap is your electricity cost in Hong Kong? That's the question here.
I think that's the other end of the question. Who the hell is stealing these things? It's like you have the option to steal the Bentley or the Toyota Corolla, and you go for the Toyota Corolla. The fact that they were headed to Hong Kong, but it was South American thieves. There's something going on in this story. There's probably a lot more here, but kind of a goofy thing to see a model that was released in 2016, 2015, just randomly pop up in the news as a major theft, trying to, whisk it away across the seas into the Southeast Asian markets.
Okay, we're going to move over to the next story, which I'll introduce and then throw to Colin for what he wrote up this week in the Blockspace newsletter on Bitcoin mining. But this was kind of a fun piece that CoinDesk put together, showed a little bit of the seedy underbelly of some of these mining operations that are out there, some of the brokerage games. This is from CoinDesk, how some Bitcoin mining firms try to game U.S. customs controls, Subdeck. The Bitcoin mining industry routinely underreports the value of imported ASIC shipments in the U.S., multiple sources told CoinDesk. So this story came out about midweek and, it follows all the tariff stuff that's been happening here in the United States. A lot of conversations around how things are imported into the US, and a pretty interesting story. Now, what this story, how it really gets interesting is they somehow found a source that they're kind of classifying the entire Bitcoin mining industry to fall under this umbrella. Essentially, they found one broker who admitted to breaking a lot of rules. And then she goes on to blame a bunch of other people for also breaking the rules. And it's kind of like spilling the beans on all the stuff that how these brokers are like underreporting or underwriting their ASIC importations as being multiples less valuable than they actually are, and how at certain ports of entry you get caught, and certain ports of entry you do not get caught. A lot of people in the mining industry are not super happy about this being in the public, I'm sure. But then on the flip side, there's also people who do things correctly and are annoyed that someone would go out there and kind of tell this story to the public when, why are you painting the industry in a bad light? So Colin, I want to throw this one to you, get your take on it, and then let's pivot and talk about your reporting this week about how ASICs are not going to fall under some of the exemptions under the Trump tariffs.
So to start with a mixed metaphor, don't throw rocks when you live in a house of glass, and don't sling mud on everyone else in your industry just because you did something that is, if not illegal, then ethically dubious. I would add a few things. Number one, underreporting with ASIC brokers is something that definitely goes on all around the world, not just in the US. I've talked to multiple miners who have had to deal with tariffs in Latin American countries who are constantly trying to duck the duties when they come in because, quite frankly, they're exploiting an asymmetry in information with regards to their industry and what the customs officers know. The other thing I would say is this is not like reporting a commodified device like an Apple computer or something that has a clear price point that is reflected across multiple jurisdictions. ASICs are not the most liquid investment. There's often price disparities between different jurisdictions, even within the same countries. And I've been told by miners who have had to deal with importations in other countries like South America that really all you need to do is prove that the ASIC can be sold for the price that you're saying you bought it for. And that's enough for you to get it through the door. Now, are miners kind of lowballing the value of their shipments? I'm sure they are. Some of them, not all of them. That would make sense to me, though. But the way that this story was framed is it was almost like they're completely cutting the value of their imports down to dodge tariffs and custom fees entirely. It's like they could be just shaving off like 5 or 10% of the value and basing that on prices that they have paid in other jurisdictions or for other hardware. To turn it back to some of our coverage at Blockspace, we did an update on tariffs for the Wednesday newsletter because there was some speculation that was percolating through Twitter and through other, social media or chat apps about will ASIC miners be exempt from tariffs according to this exemption from the Trump administration for laptops, smartphones, other computing devices, and semiconductors. That does not appear to be the case. So this exemption only applies to computing devices classified under the tariff schedule code 8471, whereas ASIC miners, according to a June 2018 ruling, are classified under code 8543. So code 8543 applies to electrical machines and apparatus having individual functions, end quote, versus the other code, which applies to computing equipment used in everyday life. So there was a brief glimmer of hope that Bitcoin miners are going to be able to duck these tariffs, but it seems like that's not going to be the case. Right now, those tariffs are 10% on Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. There's a flat tariff schedule during the pause that Trump initiated earlier in April. And so they'll be taxed at 10%. It's to be determined whether or not those reciprocal tariffs that were originally announced, which were much higher, will actually stand after the 90-day pause. I think that depends a lot on maybe what Trump ate for breakfast that morning when he talks about it, and or how negotiations go with all of these different countries. But some of the miners I spoke to were hopeful that this will blow over into more favorable winds for the mining industry. Others, though, were also saying, we're talking with clients who are trying to get out of the U.S., who are trying to establish brokerage pipelines in other countries because they're forecasting a kind of hit to their businesses as ASICs are imported less and less to the country should these tariffs hold.
Matt, anything?
I mean, just in-depth coverage there from Colin. Little to add. What I would say is
Me too.
Some background, like quick background. There is a lasting image reputation of Bitcoin being for criminals from its early days, right? But now we live in a time where there are double-digit number of publicly listed Bitcoin mining companies. The level of compliance and regulatory oversight is high, right? And because there is a common objection that based off of Bitcoin's past, that it has legitimacy. People in the industry know that, and they know that they are under higher levels of scrutiny. I mean, think about the kind of ESG wave and the way that Bitcoin got roped to that a couple years ago. I think that the companies in this space would be taking a major risk if they were dishonest, right? And I think that that's a common and well-known thing. And so I just want to highlight, I think, the maturation of the industry, and that, yes, there is compliance oversight and really accordance with the officials that matter in the States.
Miners, are you ready to earn more with what you already have? That's what Fractal Bitcoin is for. Scaling Bitcoin with Bitcoin using a fully compatible recursive design. In just 7 months, Fractals hit 18 million users and nearly 2 billion transactions. Fractal's cadence mining reduces up to 50% of your pool fee. No new hardware, no extra energy. And it's easy. FB rewards go straight to your existing Bitcoin wallet address. Over 50% of Bitcoin's hash power is already merge mining Fractal. Get more from the same resources. Start on Fractal today.
All right.
Okay, Colin, Matt, you guys ready? You guys ready for this week's segment? We're doing top 5 Bitcoin mining stories in all-time history. So if you are an enjoyer of the Bitcoin mining mines, then you might know these stories already. I'm sorry, but it's going to be a good recap for you. And then you can kind of hear the debate at the end. I think Matt and Colin will have their own ideas. And then if you are new to Bitcoin mining, these are stories you should definitely know just in terms of the lore. So as always, I'm going to rip through these 5 little ideas here. And then at the end, you guys can give me your peanut gallery takes. And if you're an enjoyer of the podcast and you don't like my choices, then feel free to chirp at me. I got a lot of chirps last week with the vibe rankings of the Bitcoin miners. And we will continue to vibe rank them every month. So stay tuned. For the first one, as you can see on the screen, Riot buys the Rockdale site. So the history here is that there was actually a former builder of this data center, the Windstone Group. They built this out. They purchased it, I believe, around 2019, and they got it going. Riot came in 2021 and completed the purchase of Rockdale. Why is this on my list? Well, I think it's really simple. I think this is one of those stories that shows how Bitcoin mining professionalized to a huge data center size, where we have one of, if not the largest data centers in the world being used for Bitcoin mining. This also brought around the conversation of using Bitcoin mining for demand response on the Texas grid. And then lastly, there's been a huge ESG and then green energy debate focused around this data center. And a lot of that was also in New York in 2021, 2022. But I think like this data campus, the size, the scope of it has been the centerpiece of many stories in mainstream media, particularly some pieces in the New York Times. So for that reason, I give it number 5 spot on my Bitcoin mining history list. Let's go over to 4. Laszlo, famous for buying pizza with Bitcoin. Obviously a very important story, but another story people don't know about is he is probably, if not for sure, the first GPU miner on the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin mining
he for sure was.
For sure was. You heard it here first on the show. We started with CPU mining, and then we went to GPU mining, and then we went to FPGAs for a short window, and then traditional ASICs, which will also be on this list in a second. But Laszlo bringing in GPU mining was a game changer. We will get into that more in a second. Number 3 on my list, the Avalon One debut. So we have this nice photo here from our friends over at the Bitcoin Mining Museum. The Avalon One was the first shipped ASIC in the market. And this sort of started changing the entire game for Bitcoin mining to industrial scale developments and not just, parents' basement. I'm mining Bitcoin on CPUs and GPUs. That still surprisingly, a lot of people think it is today. This brought about the industrial scaling of Bitcoin mining. 4 on my list, Jihan Wu, Bitmain, and I'd say like the Bitcoin corporations at the time trying to take over Bitcoin with the SegWit 2x hard fork and then the BCH hard fork as well. You can see in the screens for the timeline here, and this seems to be coming from whatever source I chose for it. It seems to be like a pro BCH propaganda, and they're showing like BCH going up in price over a short window. But the main point here is just to look at the timeline and see what happened with BCH, a very mining centric hard fork. And just to like kind of put it in context of history, I think a lot of the history gets lost here, and how it's sort of remembered now is that it was like miners versus developers and plebs. I think that's reductive, but I do think that it's close enough to the truth where we can include it in our top 5. Now, number 1, I don't think is surprising to anyone, and that's going to be the China Bitcoin mining ban of 2021. Colin and I were both working at mining companies at the time that this happened, and it was nuts. 50% of the network's hash rate went off in the course of a few days, and Bitcoin miners started fleeing China, moving to different jurisdictions, the US, Kazakhstan, South America, other places. And I think the reverberations from this Bitcoin mining ban are still being felt today. Today, there's about 20% of the network hash rate still operating in China, and there's obviously a lot of the most important players in the Bitcoin mining manufacturing space are based in China. Okay, those are my top 5. I'm going to open it up to the peanut gallery. I'll throw it to you first, Colin, to talk about Laszlo.
I honestly would put Laszlo at number 1 in terms of early Bitcoin history for the importance. I mean, I think objectively, probably the China ban is the most significant out of all of these events in terms of how it's just completely reshaped the entire industry. But what Laszlo essentially did when he introduced GPU mining in May 2010, which was shortly after he released the first Mac OS client for Bitcoin Core, he kind of introduced professional Bitcoin mining, right? Before, it was a bunch of hobbyists on their computers, and maybe some of them had a bunch of computers going on at once. But once Laszlo introduced GPU mining, you had this transition to guys setting up multiple GPUs in their homes, in their basements, in their bonus rooms, etc., to farm Bitcoin, right? And before the Bitcoin mining industry, it wasn't even an industry at that time, right? But the nascent Bitcoin mining landscape was much more of a hobbyist thing. And this, with GPU mining, transitioned us into a more professional sphere for it. And those GPU mining farms were kind of like the proto Bitcoin mining farms that are massive mega data centers that we see today, right? And a few other things about Laszlo that people don't know outside of the fact that he introduced the first Mac OS client for Bitcoin Core and also GPU mining. Most people know him, as you said, Will, for the infamous Bitcoin pizza purchase back in 2010, where he spent like 10K Bitcoin on 2 Papa John's pizzas. He facilitated the transaction with another Bitcoiner on Bitcoin Talk. But he said something to me in an interview with Bitcoin Magazine back in the day that really stood out to me. Really, he said 3 things. Number 1, he ended up actually spending something near 100,000 Bitcoin on pizza that year. So he didn't just spend the 10,000 Bitcoin that's worth a crap ton today, right? He ended up also spending 10 times that. And part of the reason that he did that was he said, and I quote, "I felt like I crapped on Satoshi's project because Satoshi had been talking to him on Bitcoin Talk saying, hey, I didn't think people were going to figure out GPU mining for a long time. And I'm a little worried about concentration of coins into few hands for the people who spin these things up." So Laszlo's pizza purchases were almost like a financial sacrifice to appease his guilty conscience for rolling this out. The last thing he said that really stood out to me was he doesn't really look back on the pizza purchase with regret. And if you see some of these interviews he's done with mainstream media, like he's got a really nice house in Florida. He's got a great family. Dude's doing fine. Those probably weren't his only Bitcoins. But he said, I wanted to do the pizza thing because to me, it was free pizza. I mean, I coded this thing and mined Bitcoin and I felt like I was winning the internet that day. I got pizza for contributing to an open source project. Usually hobbies are a time sink and money sink. And in this case, my hobby bought me dinner. So despite the sensationalizing, Laszlo has pretty good humor about it. And I do think that the GPU mining that he introduced and his contributions there get overshadowed by the pizza thing. And it was really one of the most significant developments in the history of Bitcoin mining in terms of what it did to transition us to more organized mining farms.
All right, well, I think you did a decent job, I will say. I think you did pretty good.
Better than last week with the Vibe rankings?
There's got to be some honorable mentions here, though. That's my take. Also,
Sure.
One last Laszlo tidbit, although he's dominating the show at this point, is that he was a core maintainer at one point. I mean, he is a prominent figure in Bitcoin history. Yeah, an equipment heavy top 5, first ASIC, first GPU. I get it.
True.
Big deal. I get it.
Yep.
I think that the block size wars I get that one. I think it's a little high on my list because it's more of I think Bitcoin governance top 5 in history. Although it kind of unveiled the game theory about miners, where they would choose on a chain split, right? And have that an actual practical example. But that was, I think, much bigger and messier than just mining itself. But mining is such a rich history. Like, no mention of mining pools here. Zero. There's, the big news at the time was, Ghash.io getting, near 50% of block production, questions of miner centralization. Before that, even the lesser discussed BTC Guild, I believe. You could have gone with, I think Brains had the first pool. That's a pretty big and lasting impact on the mining ecosystem. Another that I think we will kind of look back on as ushering in maybe kind of like a glimpse into the future of Bitcoin mining. So a tidbit we would add maybe a couple years from now is the first block where transaction fees outpaced the subsidy, right? And I think that may have happened like on accident a couple times in Bitcoin history. But the most notable to me was around this last halving, 2024, right? With the 4 megabyte blocks block was another one. But I think you missed a couple here. I'll be honest with you. I think you got to come back to the drawing board and maybe.
What would you take out? What would you take out of my top 5?
I think that you're
hesitancy.
You Riot a lot. I think you're giving Riot.
Riot a lot. Okay, so one.
Like you could have talked.
Would you take Laszlo out?
Era of very interesting mining seasonality in China. Your U.S. bias is coming out right now.
I mean, I put the China ban as the top. I mean, okay, I think the pool stuff is interesting. I will give you that. I think the ordinals block, that was my top 6 ordinals. But to defend my Riot pick, that brought about a huge conversation. It was the beginning of the modern industrial Bitcoin mining industry, with all the touch points from the White House to the farm country of the United States. So I think that was a great pick.
I'm not to dogpile on the CEO of Blockspace here, but I feel like the Whinstone thing was more of a reflection in the public markets of something that had been going on for a long time in the private markets. I mean, to be sure, Whinstone ended up becoming the largest farm of it
and data center in the world,
in the US. But I do think it's one of those things where I could see why you would put it in there, but maybe putting pools in its place, and maybe we do just axe the Bitcoin Cash hard fork. It definitely was, though. The hash wars are a big thing too. I would agree, because
I mean, think about it. That basically set, from a governance perspective, put miners in their place in a lot of ways, right? Where they don't have a seat at the table, and for us, we want them to have a seat at the table. So we're always advocating for that again. But they really haven't been a part of Bitcoin governance in almost a decade now. For a currency that they live off of.
It definitely did. Sorry, one thing I'll say, Matt, then I want you to jump in. It is the perfect confluence of all of the governance aspects of Bitcoin. It was the node operators, it was the miners, and it was the market choosing Bitcoin over anything else. So it does deserve a seat at the table, in the sense that the big miners backed by Jihan ended up losing. And it was a powerful testament to the incentives that underpin the entire system. But anyway, sorry, Matt.
No, it's good. That's a good tidbit. It was interesting too. I remember at the time there being op returns in Coinbase transactions that were kind of advocating for just adding commentary. I remember specifically seeing a "Make Bitcoin Great Again" op return at the time of a very contentious moment in Bitcoin history. I will push back against Will's comment that they are not a part of Bitcoin governance in the last 10 years because miners still have to flag for activation. They were a part of the Taproot upgrade. They're a significant stakeholder in the Bitcoin protocol development. That being said, I think that it did shift a lot of the way we think about how Bitcoin's protocol rules progress, right? And what really the kind of separation of powers, the checks and balances, if you will, are between the stakeholders.
We're going to leave it there for this week's tier list. We'll come back with another one next week.
All right, gentlemen, separate.
Yeah. For next week, I already have some more things cooking, more tier lists. So you guys just get ready. Anything else, Matt? Got another thought?
As the more we sit here, the more I think about things in Bitcoin history. Do you remember how big it felt the conversation was about the mining death spiral in like 2018?
Sure.
Like, the cyclical downturn of Bitcoin mining, really. And
how
like
would you describe that though? That's not like an acute moment. We're looking for like historical moments when Laszlo turned on that GPU, when Zai signed that decree to ban Bitcoin mining.
But history is not just of events, it is also of zeitgeist. It is also of anxieties of the time. I'm trying to play mediator over here.
We're going to go to the next story from our friends over the Miner Mag. We'll wrap up with this story. If you're still listening with us, you obviously love Bitcoin mining. So we're going to go to this one about Ant Alpha, which announced its forthcoming IPO this week. We covered that. For context here, before I throw it to Colin, who covered this for us in the Blockspace newsletter, newsletter.blockspacemedia.com for those who are not subscribed. Ant Alpha has a strong relationship, to put it mildly, with Bitmain and is basically a venture capital arm for them, and then a huge lending book and lending operation. Most notably and recently, they've been involved with the whole Kang stock. Colin?
Yeah, so Ant Alpha is seeking a public listing on the NASDAQ sometime this year, maybe. They didn't specify, but I think it's safe to say that it would maybe come this year or early next. They're seeking to raise $50 million, and Roth Capital and Compass Point are taking point to underwrite the offering. Now, as Will mentioned, Ant Alpha provides financing services for Bitcoin miners and a lot for Bitmain. So for those of you who don't know, what Ant Alpha will usually do is they'll provide things like ASIC financing loans to Bitcoin miners who join Antpool. And it's kind of a way for Bitmain to entice people into their pool and also keep them on the hook with a loan via Ant Alpha. They also do Bitcoin-backed loans. Their Bitcoin-backed loan business is actually larger than their financing business in terms of how much of the outstanding loans they have. But the bulk of their revenue, $38.7 million last year, came from financing, while the rest... that's for their entire book, excuse me. So all of their financing revenue was $38.7 million last year, and the rest of it was $8.8 million from fees for Ant Alpha Prime, which is a platform that people use to manage their loans through Ant Alpha. So that's a total of $47.5 million in revenue last year, with a net income of $4.4 million. As of the end of 2024, they had $1.63 billion in outstanding loans, of which $428.87 billion applied to ASIC financing and $1.12 billion, related to the Bitcoin-backed loans. Now, the interesting tidbit here is where their business is coming from and how that has shifted over the last few years. So at the end of 2024, 77.4% of Ant Alpha's customer base resided in Asia versus 6.9% in the Americas and 15.7% in a mix of Europe, Mideast, and Africa. Now, that is down on the American front and up in the Asian front significantly from 2023, where the Americas made up almost 25% of their business and Asia made up 66%. So my question with this is, how much of this is a bid for Ant Alpha and Bitmain to get its tendrils in U.S. markets so it can tap U.S.-based miners again? Maybe that's not a legitimate thing, and there's just an argument to be made that, you want an IPO in the NASDAQ so you have all this liquidity and you can, dump on new shareholders. But the shift in investor profile from Asia to America was really interesting for me, and it indicates in some part that the financing landscape in the U.S. is maturing. And miners don't have to go to a Chinese company that they don't want to take loans from that may or may not be predatory anymore. And it also probably has a lot to do with the fact that Foundry has been chipping into Antpool's dominance. So there's a lot going in the background of this story. Honestly, a good expose for us one day would be to look at all of the different business interests that Bitmain has in the Bitcoin mining space, because every corner you look, there's a web to uncover of ownership or partnership with Bitmain and all of these various companies, whether that be Analpha or, like you said, Kango earlier, Will. So an interesting IPO to keep an eye on. And I guess we could say, honestly, it's kind of the first of its kind within the crypto and Bitcoin mining ecosystem if they end up going public.
I think this is a story to watch. I think just like zooming out too, we've had lots of these various Bitcoin related companies going public, which is why we've been focusing a lot of our coverage over the last 12 months on them. To see Antalpha sort of pursue this, it's not shocking in the sense that Bitmain is wanting to get more of its tentacles into the US markets, so to speak. I mean, the whole Kang situation seems like that as well, where they sort of like reverse merge / sold all their operations to another entity that was already listed. And now they can kind of do something similar with like this venture capital / loan book that has strong connections with Bitmain. So that's just a huge story to watch. And then in general, just like how do these stocks perform that are like Bitcoin related, but not necessarily like a MicroStrategy playbook. Yesterday, we had the news about Tether, Bitfinex, Cantor Fitzgerald, Strike CEO Jack Mallers, and then there's one other company involved, SoftBank, the biggest one probably. They're all involved with this new Bitcoin MicroStrategy-esque stock that they're putting together called 21 Shares. What is it called? Do you guys remember? It's called like 21, I think.
21 Capital, I think.
21 Capital. But yeah, like how do these things perform against mining stocks? Historically, mining stocks, they're the beta play. They go up really hard and fast, or they go down really hard and fast based on Bitcoin. And I'm interested to see how they compare to the Coinbases, the 21 Capitals, the MicroStrategies over the course of the rest of the year. All this, of course, depends on how Bitcoin plays. Matt?
I mean, just excellent coverage. I don't have much to add. I have to say, when I read this story, I kind of like shuddered, like I scarred a little bit from just reading the line, the ASIC-backed loans. So I was like, from last cycle. Yeah, really what I'm bringing attention to here is just like, Will, the fact that you axed mining pools from the history here, when Luxor is a sponsor of your pod, I mean, it's unforgivable. I can't believe this development, really.
Yeah, no. I should have put Luxor launching their pool as a top 5 moment in Bitcoin mining history. Or maybe even like Colin going to Luxor and writing the hash rate index report. I mean, these are the sort of things that you're bringing to the table, Matt. These are not things that we would put in the top 5. I'm sorry. The pools, like Brains is cool, but you even called it the wrong name. It's Slush at the time. So like, it's a little nerd check on.
Oh,
true.
I still think the pools deserve to be in the top 5, though.
Maybe. I don't know. I'd like my top 5. I think my top 5 was great.
Cool.
We will close out there. We will close out with a mining pod this week. If you enjoy Matt's snarky criticisms, you can follow him on Twitter. You changed your Twitter handle recently. It's really hard to find you.
Yeah, I'm not super expressive on Twitter these days. Or X.
You save for the pod.
We can do a speed challenge where, have you seen those where you like try to list out every state on a just like piece of paper? We should do that with historical mining pools. See how many we can get. I know I would beat Will. I know it. He doesn't even think about them in history. He doesn't think about them at all. It's crazy.
We're going to close out. I'll see you guys next week. Peace.